Today I'm channeling my inner mad scientist as I share with you 3 ways to grow herbs from scraps and cuttings. Okay, so as you can see, I have displayed out here 3 groupings of odd little things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to grow herbs from cuttings 3 different ways. So 2 of these ways I've done before with great success, and one is a new method that I'm trying out and going to share my results with you. But I'm very curious of which one is going to show the best results. So to start off, we are using basil, rosemary, and sage. These are all cuttings from plants that we're growing here. The basil we're actually growing hydroponically, and as you can see by these huge leaves, it's really enjoying that environment. So to start off, you need a source of cuttings. So if you're already growing your own plants like we are, then that source is easy. If you have friends or neighbors who are growing some and are willing to give you some cuttings, another easy one. If you have a local gardening enthusiast who is friendly and willing to share, try that too. But a secret source, or a not so secret source, could be as close as your nearby grocery. They tend to purge their fresh herbs on a regular basis. So if you're brave, you can stop by your grocer and say, hey, are you throwing away any fresh herbs today? If so, there you go, free scraps to start your own plants. All right, so the first thing you need to do, regardless of what method you're trying, is you need to prep your cutting or scrap. If you're using scraps, you want to make sure that you recut the end of your sample so that way you have a clean place for the roots to grow. Anything that's dried out or damaged isn't likely to grow roots, so you want to give your scrap the best opportunity to thrive and prosper. All right, so with rosemary, what you're going to do is you're going to take these bottom leaves, roughly an inch, and you're going to carefully peel them off so that you have that much naked stem and that much leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and prep all my rosemary so they're the same. So there they are, all 3 rosemaries ready to go. Now for sage, you want to be careful because sage is kind of delicate and they grow like this. And so we're just going to strip these bottom leaves, but we want to make sure that there are ideally at least 3 good leaves still left on your sample. So that's as much as I'm going to take off of that one, and I'm going to go ahead and prep the other 2. If there's any dried or damaged leaves, you want to make sure you take those off as well, because we don't want the plant bother putting any energy in those. And then our last sample that we're going to prep is the basil. Now, because these are our hydroponic basil, I have some ridiculously large leaves, and I know that that's going to stress the plant as it's going to try to put a bunch of energy into keeping those leaves alive. So I'm going to remove the largest leaves first. Our basil grows in clusters, and so at the base where each of the large leaves were, there are already 2 much smaller leaves there. So I know that this sample is going to have plenty of leaf surface for photosynthesis, and it's going to put its energy into those smaller leaves, giving it a better start to put more energy into the roots itself. So the most simplest method to sprouting cuttings or scraps is by just putting them in water. So I have 3 small vessels here already prepped with water. These 2 are empty herb containers, and this one is actually an empty little alcohol sample. The reason why I'm using this one is because it has a thin neck, so it'll support my little tiny rosemary stalk. So I'm just going to put those in there, and I want to make sure that the water level goes to just below where the first leaves start on my sample. I'm going to go ahead and use this larger a leafed sample of the sage, because if I use one of the smaller ones, it's just going to sink right to the bottom. That is not good. Okay, so there's my simple soak in water samples. These are containers that I reused. You want to make sure if you're reusing containers, particularly if the plant had any disease or pests, that you sterilize your containers first before putting new dirt in. The dirt mixture that I have in here is our own homemade compost, so I know there's plenty of nutrients in there, but I'm also going to use a root hormone powder on my cuttings before I place them in the dirt. I have pre-moistened the dirt in my 3 containers, and I have them in this little makeshift tray to act as a saucer. So I'm just going to take my sample and take my root hormone powder, and I'm just going to dip the end in the powder and then knock off any excess, and then very carefully place it in the dirt. You want to make sure you have a nice loose dirt so you can poke your sample in there without bending it or hurting it. If your dirt isn't working out well for you, you can take a pencil or a small stick and make a hole so that way you don't put any stress on your sample, and then lightly pack the dirt around. Again, I have my sample. I put some root hormone on it, and then I carefully place it in the dirt. Again, you don't want to push your sample down below the first layer of leaves, but you're going to put it down pretty close to that. Okay, so our last test is going to be in rock wool. I'm going to put a link to this product in the description below, so if you're interested in trying this out too, you can get it yourself. But what it is these little cubes of, that's a good question. I really don't know what this is. It feels like fiberglass, but it can't be fiberglass. I'm guessing because it's rock wool, it's probably fibered rock. But I'm going to research that and put a little blurb here so I don't look like an idiot. I've gone ahead and made sure these were thoroughly moistened. And then in this glass, I have some honey. As many of you know, Brian and I are mazers, so there's always honey in the house for making mead. But the reason why I'm using honey with this is for its antimicrobial properties. I cannot say that word, so you understand what I'm trying to say. Basically, it's going to keep away any mold or fungus from my sproutling, so that way it can grow roots in a nice germ-free environment. So similar to the root hormone, I'm just going to dip the end in the honey, give it a little swirl so it's nice and coated, and then place it in the pre-moistened rock wool. Most of the rock wools that you get, or at least all the ones that I've gotten, have a small hole already in them. Sometimes it closes up when you moisten them, and if that's the case, you can use a pencil or stick to open that hole back up. And you're going to place your sample in that hole, and then with your fingers, you're going to gently push the rock wool together so that way it seals up around your sample. And we're going to go ahead and dip honey on the rest of them and place them in as well. So then your rock wool honeyed samples will look something like that. Okay, so now all 3 samples have water. This sample has nutrient from the soil. This sample has the protective covering of the honey. So now the last element that they all need is sunlight. I could leave these inside under my grow lights, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put them all on my seedling table so they can share a shaded light, which is perfect for new growth. And we will keep you updated on their progress. Okay, so it's been 29 days, and this is what our test subjects look like now. As you can see, just by quick observation as they are here, the ones in soil have the most plant growth. but the ones in the water, particularly the basil, have a significant amount of root growth. So I'm curious as to what's going on underneath the soil. We're going to take a quick close look at each specimen, and I'll tell you about what went right and what went wrong. Okay, so here you can see the rosemary, and the interesting thing that happened with the rosemary in both the rock wool sample and the water sample is that a bit of mold grew at the base of the cutting. And I found this very interesting because I've done this test once before and I didn't time it well enough to share with you, so I redid the test. But I didn't have this problem initially with the rosemary. And because remember, in the rock wool, we dipped each one into honey to try to prevent that mold growth. It was very curious to me that we had mold growth in this sample. Now, as you can tell by how sad this guy is looking, I don't think much of anything went on there. Underneath the basil, we can see the sage sample. It looks pretty good. It didn't get much growth going on, and it might have just simply been because it was crowded over with the basil, but it doesn't have any molds, and I can see some root growth in there. We're going to take a closer look at that in a little bit. Now, this is the basil. The basil obviously was the happiest of the three in the rock wool, but I was having a problem with my basil plants, and you can tell by the mutated top leaves that are all tucked and curled. We got an aphid infestation for some reason on both the sample for the rock wool and the sample in just the water. And I think that's because some of these samples I took from outside, and I'm constantly telling my viewers, particularly if you're working in hydroponics situation inside, you want to make sure that you start with seeds rather than cuttings from outside, so that way you don't introduce insects into your enclosed environment. All right, so now we'll go over to our in water samples. And you can see again, the rosemary doesn't look very happy. It is much greener than the sample in the rock wool, but if I pull it out, you might be able to see some of the mold that is growing on the stem and that there is no roots to speak of. So that's probably just going to go into the compost. The basil, again, has the weird crinkled leaves from the aphid infestation, but the roots on this, very happy. It's got all three types of root development here. The ones for gathering oxygen, the ones for gathering the water, and then the little fine ones that are trying to find nutrients. I did not add any nutrients to the water in these samples. It's just straight water. So I think that's why some of these are a little yellowed, because they might be nutrient starved. The sage, you can see its top leaves are very yellowed, and it has a little bit of brown spots. That might be because it was neighboring to the aphid infestation situation. But if you look at its roots, it does have some decent root growth on there. Not nearly as vivacious as the basil, but roots nonetheless. Now, I know a thing about sage, and it doesn't like to be wet. It doesn't like wet feet. That's a common terminology in plant growing. So I was a little surprised that it did as well as it did in the water-based solution. Okay, now to our guys in the dirt. Rosemary, obviously the most happy in the dirt environment. There have dark green leaves, it has some growth, it's got some height, and I'm gonna bet there's some good root development in there, but we're gonna disturb its happy little home in a bit to check that out. The sage, obviously much happier than its friends. It didn't grow as many new leaves as the one in water did, but notice everything is that beautiful blue-green that you typically know a sage to look like. So we'll check its roots in a bit. And then basil. This guy is leaning because it was the farthest from the light source, so it was reaching towards the light. But you can tell by its top crown here that the leaves are not all crinkled like the other ones, because this one was not affected by the aphid infestation. All right, so because of the nature of our glass samples, we can see their roots quite easily. So now we're going to do some investigation to find out what the root growth is on our other samples. So I'm going to start with the rock wool. This is our sad little moldy rosemary. I'm just going to peel this apart to see if any roots developed at all, and I am not seeing anything. I really think that mold problem that we had on this and the water sample just destroyed ever chance that those had of growing any roots and sustaining life. So now we're going to go over to the sage, and I can see already there's roots coming out of this rock wool everywhere. It's hard to tell which one is from the sage and which one is from the basil. So I'm going to pull this apart very delicately, and I can see most of the roots. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can totally see that. Most of the roots are from the basil. The basil was really happy in this rock wool environment. I thought that the root development on the water only was the winner, but after seeing that mass on the bottom of the rock wool, it's hard to say which one was more happy. But I do see sticking out of the side here of the sage some roots that are obviously from the sage. So I'm going to delicately try to pull this cube apart and see what we have going on. I know that if it has those little fine roots starting to develop, that I'm probably going to break them. But I can see by pulling it apart. So you can see right there some of the root development for the sage, and the ones sticking out the side here are these guys. So I don't want to pull this apart too much more because I'm going to destroy the roots, but I don't think that the root development was quite as strong on the rock wool for the sage as it was for the water. But comparing the yellowing of the water version and the nice color of the rock wool, I'm thinking it's a toss-up of which one was the winner there. So now we're going to move on to our potted plants, the ones that received soil. And this is going to be tricky, and hopefully I'm not going to make a terrible mess. I probably will, because I'm kind of known for that. But I want to see what the root growth was like for these samples. Probably should have put a tarp up. Okay, so this is our happy little sage plant, but if you look, now that I've pulled it out of the dirt, there is barely a root on there, and I have an idea of why this is. So my concept of why there isn't much root growth on this compared to the other samples is because it was in soil, and remember we put the root hormone on there. So I think what actually occurred is that it was pushing all its energy into the leaves rather than producing roots, which made it for a happier plant, but it didn't grow. It just sustained, if that makes any sense. So it didn't produce new roots and it didn't produce new leaves. So that concerns me for this technique for this particular cutting. Now we're going to go to the basil. This basil plant has just gone crazy. I mean, look at how happy it is and how much has grown since our little cutting that we tried. So if there's no roots under the dirt on this one, I'm going to be shocked. And there you go. There are roots aplenty on this sample. You can see that even though I gently shaked it, it is clumping the dirt in there and that root structure. So the basil is super happy in the soil environment. And my personal opinion, even though the root development seems to be thicker on the water one, I'm going to say the plant growth in this one is far superior. Now, again, that could be because this one was not affected by the aphids that the other guys were fighting, and that certainly would take some of the nutrients from the plant and deter its growth. But this certainly was a happy plant. And finally, the rosemary in the dirt. Again, we had a significant amount of growth compared to the other two. This one didn't show the sign at the base of its cutting of any mold or fungus. So let's see if we have some root growth with this one. Whoa. The answer is yes, we do. Look at all those roots. I don't even have to knock off the soil to show you the roots on this sample. They're coming out everywhere. So this was clearly a winner for the rosemary. All right, now I'm a complete mess and so is my table. But hey, that's what happens when you're working with the dirt. So in conclusion, all three of these samples worked fairly well, minus the rosemary that got the mold situation going on. But as I said before, in my previous testing, I didn't have that occur. So I think that was just something specific to these cuttings, and I'm not sure why. I would say, even so, rosemary and dirt seem to be a very happy plant. Basil, as long as you can keep the aphids off of it, seems to be happy in any situation. And the sage, shockingly enough, I would say was happiest in just the water, even though I know it doesn't like wet feet. So that might be just a weird anomaly due to starting root growth. So perhaps sage and water initially will get that root growth going, but then as soon as you see the roots, you probably want to change it and put it into soil. So, can you grow herbs from cuttings? Yes. Which method is the best? You decide. Thanks for watching. Bye.